welcome to Ask GMBN Tech, the show where we answer your questions, and all you have to do is use hashtag Ask GMBN Tech down in the comments of any of our videos on the channel, and we'll try and get back to you. And I believe you have the first question.
Yeah, it's a great one. It is from Rocket21, great name. He says he's got a new bike, it's got an air fork, it's a Rockshox with 100mm of travel. What sag percentage should be? Thanks. I mean, it's a great question, and it's one of those ones that I think pops up all the time. How much sag to set? Well, kind of depends. Rockshox have a really good guidance. Lots of their forks do have a sag measurement, so you've got a little O-ring on the stanchion of your fork, and you'll have a little O-ring that will be able to slide up to match it. But because it's a suspension fork, the travel is 1-to-1, so 100mm of travel on the fork means you need sort of 100mm of travel, which means you'll have 20 to 30% of sag, which kind of equals just 20 to 30mm of sag. So yeah, it's kind of relatively easy to do. The sag will depend on how and where you're riding and how much you need. So put on all your kit and sit on the bike, cycle the fork a little bit, and then just sit statically and just slide the O-ring down and then carefully unload the bike, and you'll be able to measure where it is. Effectively, if you've got too much and the fork is diving too much down into its travel, you're going to have to add more air. And if it's not sinking down enough, you're going to have to reduce the air. And the best way of doing that is with a dedicated shock pump. They're really accurate. And it means, A, the gauge is accurate, but the amount of air you're putting in is also accurate. Just as a tip, if this person's got an air fork, but if you've got a coil fork, essentially the process is the same, but opposed to adding air, you're going to add preload. So you're going to tighten the spring, which lowers the sag point, or you're going to release the spring and lift the fork up. But yeah, really essential, really easy to do once you've got it sorted. So yeah, hope that helps.
Yeah, and if you don't have a fork or a shock that has the markings on you, you can just work it out with a calculator and a ruler, can't you? So it will be however much the O-ring moves divided by however much travel you is, and then work that out as a percentage. So that will tell you what sag percentage you have too. We've done some videos on this, so check those out. My question is from CXCX, who says, should I get a bicycle computer or a smartwatch? Good question, or both. Maybe. So there's pros and cons to each, as there is with everything. The advantages of a smartwatch is it's usually there all the time. So when it comes to recording heart rates, it's giving you more information throughout a day. It can also record things like sleep scores and give you sort of heart rate values as well. It's a sort of a more rounded understanding of your fitness and your recovery when you're training or just exercising, so it can give you a little bit more than a bike computer on its own, which effectively will record things like heart rate value, but you will be wearing a heart rate monitor for that, and generally you don't tend to walk around every day with a heart rate monitor strap and a computer in your pocket. So that is the benefits of a watch. The benefits or the benefits of a computer and perhaps the cons of a watch alone is navigation and GPS. So if you are thinking of using it much like a sat nav to guide you around or to upload courses or just to see a map in front of you in digital form, it's much easier to use a bike GPS that's on your bike rather than looking at your watch when you're moving. I've certainly found a little bit of difficulty with that in the past, and also a watch is a much smaller screen usually than something like a Garmin will be on your handlebars. So yeah, I would say there's always pros and cons of both. If you want to use your watch for what I spoke about earlier and a more rounded understanding of training and using things like Garmin's training apps, you'll probably need both, but that's quite advanced technology there, so for training.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I split it into, I've got a watch, I'm very lucky I've got one, it's really good, it's really fun, and if I was just riding kind of trail centres and bike parks and stuff like that, I think it's awesome. It gives you almost everything that you need. Whereas for me, if I'm going out on a really big day out, like into the backcountry, as they say in America, sort of like big proper mountain biking, there's no one around me, and I want to be able to actually check where I am exactly, that's where the bar-mounted one with the navigation is just a bit easier. But that's just me. It is quite nuanced and it is personal. Okay, great question here from Elias. He's comparing gearing, a 24-36 and a 34 50 both give about the same ratio, but which one is more efficient? This is a really fun question. So we're talking a 24 front chainring and a 36 rear, and we're talking a 34 front chainring and a 50 rear. So we're looking at the lowest sort of gear. In my head, we say lowest, but obviously you might say that's the highest gear, which is a whole ballpark. And it's a really interesting question because it props up lots of things about efficiency and what your chain's doing. And on the road, the marginal gains matter a lot. And that's because, well, it's really a bit dull and you're just pedalling for ages. And there's not a lot to look at. There's not fun stuff to engage with routes and technical terrain. So you've got to worry about other stuff.
Like watts.
Exactly like watts. This is good. So a lot of sort of data and a lot of science has been done in studying how much a chain can lose watts. Chains are really, really efficient, but at certain angles, so if you're looking at the back of your bike and you look at your chain, you can see that in certain gears, there's lots of side load on it, and that actually adds watts, so you're kind of losing effectively power. The other thing that can lose watts is also if the chain has to, we're looking kind of like side on your drivetrain now, if you think about how it's got to loop round, and someone's kind of done the data on a 53 big gear, 11 at the back, versus a 48 on the front and a 10, which effectively is about the same gear inches, which is how far you could drive. One rotation of the whole drive set would drive you forward. There's an 8 watt advantage to the bigger chainring on the front and the bigger rear cassette, which is a little bit confusing because you might think, oh, okay, 10 tooth would be really efficient. But because the chain has to kind of wrap around the little tooth, and it then has to kind of wrap around the rear derailleur upper pulley, it means that there's lots of losses in it turning. So for road data, there's loads of data and loads of research to go, actually, there's these optimized chain sets and there's these optimized positions. Unfortunately, that's in really big drivetrain positions. On the mountain bike and in the kind of gear range that we're looking at, yes, there's kind of 1 to 2, maybe up to 3 or 4 watts that we'd lose, but it's not that much. And there's loads of other marginal gains, which I know sound marginal, but do add up. So getting your tyre pressure right, making sure that your chain is correctly lubed and clean, making sure you rest your drivetrain, you could gain more watts there than you would than getting the right gear ratio. So to answer this really complicated question, I think, yes, potentially the 3624 could be very marginally more efficient. However, I think what's better is if you've got a gear setup that works. So 3450 is great, gives you a nice low gear, because you can have all the marginal gains ever, but if you can't get up the hill in front of you, well, cycling is always more efficient than walking. So that's my take on it, is yeah, it might be slightly, but on a bigger hill, you could go down to a 3250 if your terrain is really steep. So yeah, that's my take on it. May not be the best answer, but I think it covers lots of bases. Let us know.
So my question is from Tivan Sanders, who says, does aluminium mountain bike rims have a maximum PSI they can handle? Does that change over age? Can carbon handle more air pressure effectively? And he's explaining that he's had some issues blowing a tyre off a WTB rim, which is now permanently damaging it, and he's not sure if his pump's correct. So there's a lot of information in that question. There will be maximum pressures for tyres, and there will be maximum pressures for wheels as well, and that will be dependent on the wheel, the model, the manufacturer. We can't say that there is a set maximum pressure for aluminium, for example, and for carbon. It will be written within the manufacturer's specs for that model, so do check that out for yours. If you have two sets, say like a tyre and a wheel, that have different max pressures, go with the lesser of the max pressures, because obviously if your wheel says the max pressure is 30 psi, for example, and your tyre is higher, well, you don't want to be exceeding the wheel's max pressure regardless of what your tyre can take. It seems that you're not quite confident in your pump's ability to read correctly. Yeah, this is an issue sometimes. Hand pumps, different brands of pumps, track pumps, they can all read differently. So the best thing to do, what I like to do, is to get a digital pressure gauge. We use Toe Peak here. They work exceptionally well at reading your tyre's exact pressure, regardless of what you've used, which may be inaccurate. So I would recommend that.
Just one thing to add actually is if you're running tubeless, it's surprisingly easy to get an inaccurate sort of like reading from whatever gauge if your valve core is all blocked and gummed up. So you might be kind of like trying to put in loads of pressure and the actual sort of the pressure on the gauge is lower because actually the gummed up section is lower, but the rest of the tyre is a really high pressure. So that's another factor just to double check. But I would also just flag that if you're running really high pressures, maybe try a bigger tyre because it's a complex topic that we can't answer briefly, but essentially like lower tyre pressures can roll quicker. So if you're wanting to have your bike roll really quickly, actually going up a tyre size, running lower pressure, it's very counterintuitive, but genuinely it does work. Even the roadies are running lower pressures in their tyres and those are quite skinny. So yeah, other option as well. Great question here from Sled5196. Essentially, he can't get his chain clean. I've been there. It's a tricky one. He goes into lots of kind of discussion about what he's doing, what's going wrong. It's a surprisingly tricky and sticky situation. And essentially, you can't sort of apply proper lubrication to your chain without cleaning it first. And some lubes out there are really gummy and really sticky. And some degreasers are actually quite mild because they're designed. So PT's, for example, is designed to work exactly in line with their lubricants. And the way they've designed it to work as a system, they don't need really harsh chemicals to degrease it. So potentially if you've been using a really heavy, thick, sticky, claggy lube, and then you're using one of these lighter degreasers, you might struggle. PT's does do a solvent cleaner, which is a great way of kind of degreasing.
The triple X.
Yeah, exactly. That's the stuff.
Pretty aggressive, yeah.
It's really aggressive. It's really powerful. So for you, I guess it's a thing of making sure that you're getting all of this other chain lube off. And I think the best technique is to, if you've got a quick link, okay, technically you can only use them once, but if you're very careful, use the right tools, I think you could probably get away with it just once or twice, which is take your chain off, put it in a kind of like a small metal pan, spray the degreaser or pour some of the really concentrated solvent remover on, and just leave your chain in there, probably overnight, give it a bit of a shake. You might have to flip it over depending on how deep it is. You will have to get a little brush on there. You can get dedicated brushes. I think actually we've got one here, which is perfect for the case. Because it's actually got grooves in it. You probably can't see, but it's a really good brush for cleaning chains. So you'll have to just use lots of elbow grease and this dedicated degreaser in a separate pan. Next thing I would do is take off your cassette. Now this might seem a bit over the top. Why am I taking my cassette off? I can just clean it on the bike. You can, but these solvent degreasers are really powerful, and the sealing on even some of the best hubs is very light. If we had a hub that was really, really well sealed, it would be quite draggy. It would be quite slow. And we want fast pickup. We want a hub that moves quickly. So often the sealing's quite light. And if you're spraying some really hardcore degreaser all over it, you're going to get some degreaser inside your hub. That's going to, well, take away the grease. And you need grease in your hub. So remove the cassette, get busy with your brush and your degreaser, and you just have to work away and clean all those black spots. It might take a couple of rinses. And then, do switch to a lighter lube. You'll be surprised that using the right condition-specific lube, so a lighter lube or a wax-based lube in the summer, drier months, and then you can switch to the kind of thicker stuff in the winter when it is kind of claggy and wet and muggy, at least in the Northern Hemisphere and in the UK. That should help you.
Yeah, what you were saying in the end, like from my personal experience, some lubes are worse than others at gathering muck into the chain. Some are more oil-based, some are more wax-based, and that will make a big difference. We have done a more detailed video on lubricants and the differences between them, so maybe check that out. Okay, so my final, last but not least, question from Chris KZ, who says, I'm a gadget man. I would love to get myself the SRAM GX Eagle derailleur for wireless shifting, but I have a full set of Dior XT gear. On my bike, how wrong would it be to use SRAM GX, presumably wireless derailleur and shifter with the XT gear, so the cassette, the chain, the brake levers, etc. Okay, Lots of points there. So there's a difference between the SRAM AXS or the Axis wireless stuff that came out before the one that we have now, which is the T-type. The most recent SRAM wireless group sets, the T-type, is supposed to be used as an ecosystem. So it has a special chain, the cassette picks up in different ways that mean that it pairs with derailleur properly, and you're supposed to use the whole thing to work together perfectly. It's not recommended to be used with other stuff, and certainly not Shimano, I'm sorry to say. The old SRAM AXS stuff, or the first iteration of wireless group sets, was the derailleur and the shifters were able to be used with mechanical SRAM stuff, so the cassettes, the chain, you can mix and match with that. However, SRAM will tell you that mixing and matching with Shimano is not best practice, and that's sort of the bottom line. So it's possible that you could try using some of the older style Axis with it if you want to save money, and seeing if it works. Presumably you're going to need to replace that chain and those chain rings soon anyway, because you've used it for a while, so you might have to upgrade it to something relevant in the near future anyway. So it's up to you whether you want to experiment in the meantime, but it isn't generally recommended.
And just if you do try it, just if you do, you're not saying it, we're not recommending it. The thing that you will kind of come to kind of like a bit of a pause on is, as you mentioned, kind of like, oh, what do I do with the shifters? So Shimano has its own iSpec or iSpec 2 mounts for its shifters. SRAM's got its own matchmaker, and you'd be like, oh, great, these will be compatible. Oh, they're not compatible. But there's a couple of companies out there that make little shifter mounts that will make one shifter and one brake system work with vice versa. So problem solvers do a mismatch instead of matchmake systems. So yeah, you've got different iterations. So just be aware that there is iSpec 1 and iSpec 2. I've made the error that there are different Shimano mounts. So just be aware of that. But obviously we don't recommend doing it. So don't send us any pictures of it. Please do send us pictures.
Maybe into Top Mod. They should send it into Top Mod. Our uploader link is below. But that's all we've got time for. So thank you so much for your questions. And if you're watching now and you have a burning question, well, head down into the comments and use hashtag Ask GMBN Tech before your question so that we can find it and answer it on a show like this. But thank you for now, and we'll see you again soon.